Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a little town called Durham, which is about 140 miles south of here.
What was your childhood like? What was Durham like?
It's a small town. I used to joke and say that there were more people in the graveyards than there were upright. And that's pretty accurate. There were about 900 people when I grew up. I went to a one-room school. There were 8 grades in one room. There were 3 people in my class. I like to tell people I was at the head of my class, but there were only 3 of us, and one of them was foolish. So there weren't that many. And it was mostly dirt roads in those days, and we had running water, but it dried up in the summertime because we had a shallow well, and then we had to lug it from the pump at the parsonage. It was a very British upbringing, really.
Were you writing as a child?
Well, I wrote a little bit of everything. I think that when you're a kid, you're a little bit like milk in the refrigerator. You take the flavor of whatever is next to you in there, so that if I was reading Westerns, I wrote Westerns, and if I was reading science fiction, I wrote science fiction, and if I was reading horror, I wrote horror. And I read more horror than anything else, and so I wrote more.
Were you scared as a child?
Yeah, I would say that I was scared a fair amount. I had a big imagination, so I could imagine all sorts of things that would happen, from rational fears, like losing my mother, who was my only parent. My father deserted deserted her and my brother and I when I was 2 and my brother was 4. So as a kid growing up in a single-parent family, you worry about that. You're afraid of that. But I was afraid of the dark because I wasn't afraid of the generic dark. I was afraid of what might be in the dark, you know. And I could visualize all sorts of things. And like most people with big imaginations, when things are going well and the lights work, everything's under control. But the horses would have a tendency to slip their bridles a little bit when the lights were out and I was by myself. And I'd worry about what was under the bed or what might be hiding in the old church I had to pass to get back from my friend's house. So I would say that I suffered with my imagination a fair amount of the time. But of course, in the end, it's taken care of me in my old age, so to speak.
At 47, Stephen King isn't quite ready for the pension yet, nor does he need one. He's the world's richest author, earning more than £1 million each month. He writes every day of the year except 4: Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year, and his birthday. More than 75 million of his books are in print, and he's so prolific that he writes still more horror stories under the pseudonym of Richard Bachman.
There was no one moment when I realized that fear was worth writing about, but there were a series of accreting moments where I started to realize that one of the great themes of American life, as I understood it, was the irrational outbreak of violence and how strange the people were that did it. I've told the story before, but there was a mass killer in Nebraska in the 50s, Charles Starkweather, who went on a killing spree with his girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate. And he's a figure, it seems to me, he's a seminal figure in modern American life, post-war American life anyway. He's the first serial killer. People asked him, Charlie, why did you do it? And he kind of went, felt like it, you know, which is an amazing existential statement. Saw it, would have loved it, felt like it. Ever since then, when I write about monsters and when I write about supernatural creatures, vampires, werewolves, whatever, I'm trying to remind myself that these things are only analogs for all the things in our lives that are totally inexplicable, and they're not very nice.
When I was smaller, I used to get into my mum's bed after Dad had put on his uniform and gone off to work in Portland. I used to sleep beside her for an hour before breakfast. Dark, fear, firelight, shadows like praying mantises. I didn't want to be put in these woods 70 miles from the nearest town with these drunk men. I wanted my mother.
It's the world that I know. When I was a kid, first taking writing courses in high school, one of the things that I heard was write what you know. We were told this over and over again. And I thought to myself, I never had the nerve to say this out loud. I wasn't as mouthy then as I am now. My idea was, if you lived in a little house in the country on a dirt road and had to lug water in the summertime and go to the bathroom in an outhouse because there was no water, you wouldn't want to write about what you knew because this is boring. This is just dumb. So I'd write science fiction or I'd write westerns or whatever, because what I was doing, the basic function of my writing as a teenager, was to escape from a life that I regarded as boring and stultifying. Later, when I got to college, little by little I started to get a perspective on that life, and I started to ask questions about the life that I'd lived then and was living now. And I began to see the way that I could combine fantasy to illuminate a life that I'd considered boring. And the minute that I did that, it turned into Wonderland for me.
How did you get started as a writer?
I sold a story called The Glass Floor, which was a kind of Poe-esque tale, to a magazine called Startling Mystery Stories, one of the last of the pulps. That was in 1969. I was 22, and it was $35.
Had you always wanted to be a writer?
Well, I had the ambitions that kids have, that you want to grow up and become a Texas Ranger and fight Indians in the West, and then you discover, well, we're not really fighting the Indians anymore. That's just at the movies. Or you want to be a fireman or a policeman. Those were all passing fancies. I seem to remember that I wanted to be an astronomer for a while and study the stars. But you find out what you're good at.